Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, April 11th, day 552 of the war. Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter Emanuel Fabian, who is a pinch hitter for our usual star, Lazar Berman, our diplomatic reporter. Manny, thank you so much for stepping up to the plate today.
Hi, Amanda. No problem.
We are going to actually have a very serious episode today, and we're going to take a look into several of the IDF probes into the disaster leading up to the October 7th Hamas onslaught. We're going to, first of all, take a step back and quickly discuss the broad strokes conclusions from these reports so far, and then we're going to drill into several examples of these reports that came out within the past week, including the report on Sderot, the report on Kibbutz Nirim, the report on Kibbutz Re'im, and the report on the Supernova rave. So it will be a difficult episode, and I would like you to keep that in mind as we go further. We will discuss all of this and more after the break.
I like what I do as a Jew, and I find it interesting and meaningful, but I want to learn about what's out there and how do the rest of our people connect.
You come in knowing some things, but nobody here knows everything, because everyone has had like puzzle pieces, and together we kind of make up this whole larger puzzle.
I think the Hartman Fellowship has impacted me as a Jewish leader more than any other Jewish program that I've done, because it sort of broadened my horizon on what exactly it means to be a Jewish teen and what sort of Jewish teen learning looks like.
And we're back. Some 5,600 Hamas-led terrorists infiltrated into southern Israel on October 7th, slaughtering around 1,200, mostly civilians, and taking 251 people back to Gaza as hostages. Manny, we'll talk about specific examples in a minute, but I would like to hear, first of all, what are the goals of these IDF probes so far?
So the investigations and the top level one that we've spoken about before on the podcast, and these battle investigations are for the army to learn. The army, at the end of every operation, does a debriefing, which is basically going over what happened during an operation, what went well, what went wrong, so to be able to learn from it. October 7th, of course, was not a military operation, but the army was activated. It carried out various activities that day to try and defend against southern Israel against the Hamas attack, and now it's taken a very long time. Normally debriefings are carried out immediately after an operation, but because of the sort of the scale of Hamas's attack, it's taken a while. But the point is that these battle investigations are mainly tactical investigations to learn better how to deal with a surprise attack on an Israeli border community, for example, how troops can operate better, how the army can deploy forces faster or better, or what equipment needs to be prepared there, and other things like how the army should be coordinating with civilians. We know that from some of these investigations that some communities and towns, their civil defense squads weren't prepared by the army correctly, or they didn't have the right weapons with them, or they weren't even told by the army that there was an infiltration. So that sort of thing, coordinating with the civilians, coordinating with the police, and basically to learn for the future to make sure that such an event doesn't happen again.
Right. And just to emphasize again that this is a IDF probe, meaning this is the IDF investigating the IDF, not investigating even the police. There are police reports, not investigating the Shin Bet. There are Shin Bet reports. There is, of course, some cooperation between all of the different wings, and obviously not investigating the political echelons. Very important to emphasize. Now, as we've been hearing more and more of these reports, we're learning some very common conclusions, essentially. Obviously, the IDF has taken responsibility for this and has said over and over in each of these reports that the IDF was not prepared, was not able to save the people who were killed or taken hostage. And so just give us a little bit of the general conclusions before we delve into very specific examples.
I mean, all of these investigations, and they're all different in certain ways, but the bottom line is they all have the same conclusion, which is the IDF failed to defend the community of whichever community it is. All of these investigations have this line in their conclusions. The reason as to why the army failed to defend the residents of a community, or the Supernova party, for example, mainly comes down to the army wasn't ready to deal with a wide-scale surprise attack. It didn't have the right amount of forces on the border. It didn't train for such an event. It had no even sort of responses to carry out to such an event happening. That's basically the main conclusion. And then other investigations found sort of differently, but in most cases it is that the army did not reach the communities in time. Most of the Hamas atrocities were carried out within the first 6 hours or so. In some communities, it was even the first hour or so. Hamas murdered and abducted civilians. The army at the time, the few troops, 767 soldiers deployed to the border that morning, half of what it normally is because it's a weekend. They were unable to reach these communities because of the wide-scale attack. They were busy defending their own positions. They were trying to defend the army posts on the border, or they were killed, and there was no soldiers to come and aid the communities that were being attacked. So in pretty much every investigation, there's a few outliers. The army never reached the community in time. The Hamas terrorists carried out their atrocities and left before the army reached there. The reason why the army didn't get to these communities in time, and this is really across the board in all the investigations, is the army didn't know what was going on that morning. They had no accurate picture of what was happening during the attack. They didn't know which communities were coming under attack. They didn't know where to send soldiers to. They didn't have soldiers ready to even send them. Not enough soldiers, at least. There is a small amount of reserve forces who are, ready to be activated, but it wasn't nearly enough to reach any of these communities in time. And you'll find that just in all the investigations that the army didn't reach in time because they didn't know where to send them. And you'll find in some cases where the army never reached at all. The terrorists all left before the army came, and in other cases the army did battle the remaining terrorists. But that's basically the sort of the bottom line of all of these investigations. Are those sort of main findings.
And there are several consistent locations, meaning there are the kibbutzim and the moshavim, the smaller communities around the Gaza envelope, the Otef Aza, as we call it. And there were some cities involved. That would be Sderot and Ofakim, for example. And then there was, of course, the cluster of parties that was in the Reim forest. That would be most famously the Supernova or Nova party. But there's also Siduk and another party, a smaller gathering in this forest at the same time. So today we're going to drill down into all three of these different kinds of venues for battle. And let's start with Kibbutz Nirim. And it's in reading your assessment of the report, it's very similar to other small communities near the Gaza envelope. And in this case, on the morning of October 7th, some 150 terrorists reached the border community, and they murdered 5 civilians there and abducted 5 others. So, Manny, what jumped out to you in this particular report on Kibbutz Nirim?
So in this case, the army actually responded very quickly. The troops deployed to the border that morning. In other communities, like I said, the army didn't get there for 6, 7, 8 hours later. In Nirim, the army was there, and they actually managed to defend against the first wave of terrorists. The reason why the army got there so quickly, Nirim is in the Gaza division, the army unit that's responsible for the Gaza border, is split into 2 brigades. There's the Northern Brigade and the Southern Brigade. Nirim is part of the Southern Brigade, and the commander of the Southern Brigade, Asaf Hamami, he was in his headquarters as the attack began. He saw that there was an infiltration on the border. The first infiltration, at least in the southern brigade area, basically the southern part of the Gaza border, was just across from Nirim. And he thought, because under the IDF's sort of scenarios that they have, is that an infiltration on the border, if there's going to be an infiltration attack, it'll be in 1 or 2 locations on the border at most. Of course, in reality, Hamas infiltrated from 114 locations. But what happened is he saw this first infiltration near Nirim, and he immediately set out with his team to the community to go and protect it. And other soldiers joined him as well, and they stationed themselves around the kibbutz. And Hamami and his team were inside the kibbutz. They reached there very quickly. And they exchanged fire with the terrorists, and the troops outside exchanged fire with the terrorists. They killed dozens outside the community. Really, it's one of the rare cases where the army was there to defend the town. Although in this case, at least the investigation found that sort of later on, in a few hours later, Hamami and his team had already been killed. The troops deployed outside were, their numbers were going down. Their commanders had been killed. Many of the soldiers there were wounded, and the few surviving troops who were really killing dozens of terrorists outside Nirim were then called to go to another area. One part of the investigation that really stood out to me is the most senior commander there at the time in the Southern Brigade was a sergeant, just a commander of a patrol that was in the south that day. All the company commanders were killed or wounded. The brigade commander, of course, was killed, and his team as well. So a very small amount of forces, and then they were basically diverted to another area. There was another army base on the border that was being attacked, and they went there. And as they left, the other Hamas terrorists infiltrated the kibbutz, around 80 or so, and that's when the abductions and murders of the civilians took place. And then the IDF would, of course, later reach the community later in the day and push the remaining terrorists out and kill the others. And that's a similar story to, of course, other kibbutzim that day.
So what it sounds like you're saying is that the army was there immediately at the advent of the onslaught, felt like it had done its job, or everyone was killed who was doing the job, and then only later, again, after a second wave of terrorists infiltrated, did the army come again much later in the day to help the kibbutz out again.
Yeah, the soldiers deployed to the border again. They didn't even know that a second wave of terrorists had infiltrated the community. They were really small numbers at this point, and they were sent elsewhere. They had done a good job defending against the first wave, and no civilians were being hurt in the community during those hours. But of course, just like everywhere on the Gaza border, the army didn't have enough troops that day. 700 soldiers against 5,600 terrorists is not exactly a fair fight. So in this case, once the soldiers weren't there, then the terrorists infiltrated. It was mainly by chance. It wasn't. It was a coincidence that they left at the same time as the second wave of terrorists came. But even if they were there, they wouldn't have been able to stand against the numbers of the second wave of terrorists. But the army did leave the community vulnerable because no backup troops arrived until much, much later.
Right. And part of the reason is what we're going to discuss right now, which is the city of Sderot. And obviously, no one can forget the images of the terrorists riding on the white pickup trucks throughout the city, brazenly mowing people down in the city of Sderot. And because of this attention, in a way, many people, many soldiers were drawn to the city of Sderot, not knowing that this infiltration was occurring throughout southern Israel along the Gaza border. And so at one point, there were some 1,000 Israeli security forces in Sderot, which is a city of 38,000. It's a real city that needs to be defended, whereas in so many other locations that we've been discussing and will discuss, there were just no forces at all. So many tell us a little bit about what caused this bottleneck of troops in a way.
It's a geographic problem, and I'll explain. So the city of Sderot is located on the main highway that goes from the north to the south in the Gaza border area. So all of these soldiers, who some of them were called up, some of them were arriving on their own accord, if they were arriving from central Israel, from Tel Aviv, or from anywhere north of Sderot, they were going to pass through Sderot. So all of these soldiers trying to flow down south ended up in Sderot. The attention from the video on social media and on television also drew a lot of people, but the soldiers that were trying to reach the Nova or trying to reach Nahal Oz or other communities just ended up in Sderot anyway. But geographically, some of the investigators who presented these probes to reporters, they called it the Sderot traffic jam, because it literally was a traffic jam in Sderot. Another big issue was Hamas, in its well-planned attack on Israel, took control of the main junctions on the highway, and we saw this in other investigations where troops trying to reach communities came under fire by ambushes at junctions and on the sides of the highway, and we'll see it also in the Reim investigation. Because of this, because Hamas took the main junction outside Sderot and also some of the ones further south as well, even if troops wanted to push down from Sderot, they couldn't, because they would just get stuck in ambushes on the highway, and it took a few hours for the army to actually push through these junctions and clear them of terrorists before they could push further south. In the Sderot investigation, I mean, you can see that there were a lot of terrorists that attacked the city, 41 to be exact, but the infiltration occurred up until sort of an hour, 2 hours into the onslaught, and after that, terrorists stopped infiltrating, but troops continued to arrive in the community. So even when the army essentially had, well, not the army, the police actually were the ones who were fighting there first, but once Israeli forces had control over the city, no more terrorists were invading. There were 20 or so terrorists in the police station, which we can talk about as well. But there wasn't a widespread attack across the city. All the terrorists were in one building. You don't need hundreds of troops for that. You only need a small amount of forces to handle that. They're all stuck in one building. But even then, hundreds of forces were still in the city. They were searching and looking for anything, and that's great. But a kilometer down the road, civilians were being massacred and nobody was reaching them. If in Nirim, for example, the investigation there found that, and it's not very far from there, the investigation found that they were calling for help and trying to reach the police and trying to reach the army, but nobody came, and all the forces were stuck a few kilometers up the road in Sderot.
Right. I mean, we've talked about this mass chaos of that morning. Nobody knew where any of the terrorists weren't. And obviously, all the members of all the communities were phoning and trying to get help by any means possible from the army, the police, any security force that could possibly be around. Now, in Sderot, what is also iconic is, of course, the demolition of the police station, and we're going to talk about that. But I also want to emphasize something that I read in your report on the report, which is that the security team of the city was completely not in shape for any kind of infiltration at all. It was a small security team, something like 24, if I'm not mistaken, and many of them weren't even armed because the arms had to be locked up in some central locker. So talk about this really major fashla, as we say in Hebrew.
Yeah, so it sort of stems from this decision made in August of 2022, where the army required all the Gaza border communities, including Sderot, to return their assault rifles. That are, the army is the one who's arming and training these local security teams. They required them all to return their rifles back to the military because of a series of break-ins in which the weapons were stolen. The army conditioned returning the rifles to the members of the security team if they had a method of locking up their weapons, either in their homes in a safe or in a central armory in the city. Because of bureaucratic reasons, as the army explains it, this didn't take place. No funding was made to build an armory. They didn't fund safes for the for the members of the security team to have these weapons in their homes. And you will see this is different from the Reim investigation, which we'll talk about as well. The local security team did not have their assault rifles with them, and as a result, they were left only with their pistols, their handguns, with a limited amount of ammunition. I don't know if you know, but when you get a license for a handgun, you're only allowed 50 bullets with you. And they were dealing with heavily armed terrorists, right? They were on pickup trucks with loads of weapons, with tons of magazines, and there was nothing really they could have done to deal with such an overwhelming number. Another big issue was that the army didn't actually train the security team. So the investigation found that 2 years before October 7th, no training drills were carried out with the army. In other communities, you'll find that the army's carried out drills once a year, once every 6 months or so, but with Sderot, none were carried out. And the army also didn't provide Sderot. They call it a defense dossier. It's like a document that sort of details what to do in various scenarios. Sderot didn't have one. So even if the security team was trained, they wouldn't know, what to do in a certain event.
I assume part of that is because there's a police station in Sderot. And so one would expect that if there is some kind of, 2 or 3 terrorists infiltrating, that the police would be able to handle it. Nobody expected this number of terrorists coming in. So let's move to the police station and the really terrifically heroic battles that occurred there inside and on the roof of the police station. And of course, this battle ended in the demolition of this building. So tell us a little bit about the timeline even of this particular battle.
So, right, just as the sort of onslaught started, it was just before 7 a.m. A group of around 26 Hamas terrorists on pickup trucks, and they also stole a civilian vehicle as well, drove into Sderot. On the way, they at the entrance to the city, they murdered a civilian, and just inside the city, they murdered another civilian. But just after 7, they reached the Sderot police station. That was their target in this attack. The other group of terrorists would attack other areas. They reached the police station. They killed one of the officers there, and then they attempted to storm into the police station and to try and take it over. And of course, they would eventually be able to do that later on. What the terrorists did is they set up sort of ambush points on the road outside the police station, and anyone who was trying to, we saw cases of civilians trying to seek help by coming to the police station after being shot elsewhere, and also police officers arriving to try and assist, because of course the officers there had reported in that they're being attacked by terrorists. The terrorists basically would open fire on anyone approaching the area. They basically hid on the side of this road there. And opened fire on anyone arriving, and they ended up killing several police officers there and several civilians also there as well. The officers inside the building, most of them headed to the roof, so it's a 2-story station. One of these officers, Aviad Aka, opened fire from the roof on the terrorists, killing 4 of them. And then this caused the remaining terrorists, those who were still outside, to rush inside the building to seek shelter, basically. Inside, there was major battles that took place. Several officers were killed during exchanges of fire with them, and there were still several officers on the roof. Later in the morning, sort of not even that much later, it was like 20 minutes, half an hour later, officers began to arrive outside the station. They tried at around 8 in the morning to sort of retake it, to enter. They came under fire. They made another attempt half an hour later, and several officers were killed. And they kept on trying for a few hours to go in, but then the terrorists were on the stairwell and opening fire at the officers trying to come in. At around 1:30, the elite Yamam unit was there, and they tried sort of via the roof. They used a crane to rescue the officers who were stranded on the roof. They did manage to rescue them. They also tried to sort of recapture the roof and recapture the station using the roof, but it was unsuccessful as well. The terrorists kept on opening fire. They were, of course, well armed. And it was around 4 p.m. where after realizing that no more officers were inside the building, or at least no more officers that were alive were inside the building, all those who were living were rescued. And the IDF had already arrived in the area. They carried out a tactic known as pressure cooker, which is when you escalate the volume of fire against a building to flush suspects out. The police officers fired shoulder-launched missiles at the building. Some of the terrorists tried to flee, and they were then killed by soldiers and police officers stationed outside. In the evening, at like 10:30 or so, at night already, the Israeli Air Force carried out a drone strike on the building. At 11:30, the army had a tank there and started firing shells at the building. There was a helicopter that passed by at around 2 a.m. and fired at the building. The terrorists were still inside. And then throughout the night, the army brought an armored bulldozer to try and tear down the building. Sort of throughout the night, terrorists kept on trying to flee the building amid sort of this escalating fire against the building. I think the last terrorists around 2:15 in the morning, 4 of them tried to flee and they were all killed outside. And then at around 8 or 9 in the morning, already on October 8th, one final terrorist was killed as sort of the army went back in again with forces, and it was declared cleared of any threats at around that time. And the building was so heavily damaged at that point. It had been blown up by a tank, by a drone, by a helicopter, by an armored bulldozer, by shoulder-launched missiles. It was on fire. And then, of course, later it was completely torn down and by authorities, and they've rebuilt a new station, as far as I understand, in that area as well.
It seems like a lot of resources went into this one particular battle, and I assume partly because it was so symbolic, but also partly because people still didn't know fully what was going on everywhere throughout the Gaza envelope area.
Like I and my wife, like we were mourning with people, but because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in Dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement. I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's like a generous interpretation. And my argument was actually not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how like Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, like this, what happened is heinous and horrible. And there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is, you got what you deserved, and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us.
And we're going to turn now to the Supernova rave, which is also a situation of just not knowing. The army had really no idea what was happening there during the massacre of some 380 people, including all the security forces who were killed there. And it's just so puzzling to me how this chain of events could have happened, because by all indications, the organizers of this outdoor music festival, the Supernova Festival, really checked all the boxes ahead of this party, got all the permissions, they toured the site with the Homefront Command, everything was completely by the book, and yet the army, in all the mass chaos, just didn't really know that this mass slaughter was happening there at a place where there were some 3,000 partygoers attending and another 400 staff. And just to make matters worse, of course, there were security guards there, but there were 75 security guards who were unarmed. So they're more to keep order during the party, not to ward off a terrorist infiltration. So obviously it's so upsetting because, as I said, some 344 civilians and 34 security personnel were murdered or killed. The terrorists abducted another 44 to the Gaza Strip, many of whom are still there or who were killed in captivity. So, Manny, this particular disaster in which the army was told about this party, the army should have been protecting this army, it just hits so terribly. What can you tell us about this particular real failure?
So the party was approved according to all the sort of relevant protocols. The IDF is there to, provide security, and the police needed to also approve for safety-related matters. And because at the time, October 5, 6, 7 was a relatively quiet period, of course, up until 6:29 a.m. There was no major sort of nothing was happening in the army, so they approved this party, even though it is somewhat close to the Gaza border. It's like 4 or 5 kilometers from the border. The army needs to approve it based on sort of the deployment of air defenses. So because we're talking about a large gathering of people in one area, the army needs to know to defend against a potential rocket fire. That was the threat that was sort of presumed at the time. This investigation really only looks at the Nova party area, sort of where the attack took place and the adjacent highway, but not where the Nova partygoers were killed. Of course, the number you mentioned, 344 civilians. I wouldn't say most of them, but around maybe half of them were not killed at the party area. They were killed elsewhere in the Gaza border, sort of an area stretching like 50 or so kilometers from the northernmost murder to the southernmost. The bodies of 171 were found in the party area, and 16 were abducted by the terrorists there, and the others were killed all across southern Israel. 60 were murdered just near Mifal Sim, so there's a part of the road there where many of the Nova partygoers were killed and 10 were abducted. Another 60 or so were murdered next to Reim, which we'll talk about. So all over the south, there's a separate investigation that's dealing with the attacks on the highways and on the junctions during October 7. But what I wanted to say is that despite the army approving this party near the border, according to all the protocol, the troops actually deployed to the border that morning were not aware of this party. The commanders were sort of made aware, but the troops on the ground had no idea. They didn't realize that 3,500 people were close to them partying in sort of this forested area. Could that have changed the outcome that morning? I'm not sure, because the army anyway was completely overwhelmed and unable to respond to anything, but maybe the army would have gotten there quickly, maybe something would have changed. The investigation does highlight, although the army didn't investigate the police, but it does highlight the bravery of police officers and some very quick decisions that were made by some officers there. The commander of the police, sort of responsible for the party, is the head of the Ofakim police station. He at 6:35 a.m., so 5 minutes into Hamas's sort of rocket fire, decided to shut down the event. He told the organizers, he spoke over the loudspeaker and called on everyone to disperse and end the event. It's thought that by doing this at this stage, he managed to save hundreds, if not maybe thousands of people who managed to flee the party before the terrorists managed to take the major junctions. Very shortly after, really just before 7 a.m., the terrorists were already taking the junctions, and they were shooting on these fleeing partygoers. And another decision made by police was that they realized that the roads weren't safe. People were returning back to the party after coming under fire from both directions, both trying to head north and head south. So the police opened up a dirt road through the fields and told people to head that way, and many did on foot and not in their cars because there was such a crazy traffic jam there. And this also saved hundreds of partygoers who managed to flee and reach the community of Patish. Everyone who went through this dirt path survived. None of them were hurt by heading this way. The other partygoers who tried to flee north or flee south or tried to reach other nearby border communities was among those that were either murdered or abducted or were injured in Hamas's attack. The army, of course, wasn't around. They didn't reach the area for many hours. There was one tank that was missing most of its crew. It was just the driver at this point. One member of the tank had already been abducted, Staff Sergeant Shai Levinson. Another soldier, Sergeant Ariel Eliyahu, was killed, and Ophir Testa, he was seriously wounded in the tank as well. And what they did is Testa and the driver, Corporal Ido Somech, they reached the party area, and Testa handed his rifle to one of these unarmed security guards and gave him the weapon in order to fight back, and then he was also killed right there and then. This tank, although it's just one single tank with just the driver, he can't operate any of the weapon systems or anything, but the tank was used by a group of police officers there and several of the partygoers, a few dozen partygoers. They used it to take cover. So this tank moved back down the highway going south as the terrorists were pushing sort of from the north. And these partygoers and the police officers were basically able to take cover behind this tank. Of course, the tank wasn't firing or anything; it was just the driver. But this was a major sort of event during the attack on the Nova Festival that enabled a lot of people to be saved.
It's so upsetting to me, Manny. I mean, all of it is upsetting, is that Hamas apparently didn't even know about the party, and they just came upon it by happenstance, perhaps being driven off from other communities. And then they happened upon this party where thousands of mostly young people, 20 to 4-year-olds mostly, were often quite inebriated as well, and that of course made them, as one party goer told me, in the day following everything. I spoke with one young woman on October 7th in the afternoon, and she said that they felt like they were fish in a barrel, that they're just being shot up by these machine guns like fish in a barrel. And it's just incredible to think that it was a matter of really terrible luck that Hamas happened upon the party itself.
Yeah, the terrorists, according to the IDF's investigation, were trying to reach Netivot, which is much further northeast. They had no knowledge of this party. They decided then and there, these 100 terrorists, to carry out the massacre there. They went the wrong way. They breached into Israel. They were supposed to head north and then east towards Netivot. They went south and they happened upon the party there. It was really by chance that they reached there. In other areas, we can see that Hamas terrorists either went the wrong way or they weren't able to reach their destination and they decided to go into other communities as well. And this happened in Reim also.
So of the 44 hostages who were taken there, 17 are still in captivity, including 11 living and 6 declared dead. The other 27 has since returned to Israel. And among the 34 security personnel that you spoke about who were killed during the rave were 16 soldiers, 12 of whom who were off duty and attending the rave, so I don't know where you would count them as civilian or soldier, and 4 who were killed while fighting the terrorists. 16 police officers, 15 were killed fighting the terrorists, and 2 Shin Bet agents, one of whom was also attending the party. It's just a huge disaster. And many of them, as you said, many of the people attending this rave were fleeing the party. And I spoke with a young man who fled the party the day after this happened, and he gave me a really chilling account. His name is Shai, and you can find it on our website. I'll add a link to our program notes. And it was just luck, essentially, that he went one way and not the other way. And many of the party goers went to Kibbutz Re'im, which is, I think, the closest settlement to the Re'im forest. And so the people of Re'im, this kibbutz, had to, of course, secure themselves, but at the same time, they were also offering shelter to so many of these party goers who fled. So, Manny, let's close our discussion, our very dark discussion, with focusing on Kibbutz Re'im, where 100 terrorists arrived on the morning of October 7th.
So some of these terrorists, interestingly enough, according to this investigation, were trying to reach the Nevatim airbase, which is very far away from Re'im. It's like 70 kilometers or so further east in southern Israel. And just like in other areas, they turned back and went to Reim after coming under fire by police in one of the junctions. Reim is, to me, it shows that when the local security team is well prepared and trained and knows what to do, they could do a very good work, and they did do very good work that morning. They were well armed. Unlike Sderot, all of these local security officers all had assault rifles in safes in their homes. This was funded by the kibbutz because they realized it was important. They all had tactical gear. They had vests and helmets. They had radios like Motorola's to communicate with each other. They had lots of ammunition to fight back. When the attack began, they immediately deployed themselves to various vantage points in the community near the entrances, anticipating a terrorist infiltration. So they were really well prepared. Unfortunately, when you only have 6, or I think they maybe had 8 members of the security team that morning that were there, you can't do that much against 100 terrorists infiltrating. But still, even with their small numbers, they managed to do quite a lot. In the beginning, the terrorists carried out the sort of the massacre. They killed 7 civilians and abducted a further 5, but this occurred within sort of a half an hour to an hour period of time. From that point, no more abductions or murders were actually carried out. It was mainly only fighting between the security team and police and members of the army who also arrived later. But it really does highlight that even with a small number of forces and the appropriate weapons and the appropriate training, they were able to make a huge difference. You mentioned the Nova, so 42 partygoers from the Nova Festival ended up inside Re'im and took shelter there, and they all survived. There was, of course, many others who took shelter in the roadside bomb shelter outside the community, the sort of infamous bomb shelter where I think 27 people were there, and very few of them survived. We're talking about the bomb shelter where Aner Shapiro, an off-duty soldier, hurled back grenades at the terrorists before being killed, and his best friend Hersh Goldberg-Polin was abducted to Gaza along with others. That was outside the community and not included in this investigation. But essentially, those who reached the community were aided by the residents of the community, who, of course, themselves were also trying to protect themselves and their neighbors. At one point, the terrorists tried to infiltrate the main residential area and set fire to homes and trees there and cars. And the residents sort of went out their homes and started to put out the fires at their neighbors' homes and to rescue their neighbors. It was very, very impressive that these residents were all helping each other out, even as dozens of terrorists were in their community trying to murder people. Another major point of the Re'im investigation is that the army did arrive to the community. Backup forces did several hours later. Many police officers did as well. But several special forces units reached Re'im, including Sayeret Matkal and the elite multi-domain unit. And they basically tried to battle these was several terrorists who had sort of holed themselves up in several homes in one of the neighborhoods. And it took many, many hours to actually close in on all of these terrorists and eliminate all of them. And during this fighting, several senior officers were killed. Roy Levy, the commander of the multi-domain unit, several other top commanders in Sayeret Matkal. Also, two very senior police officers were killed. Itzik Buzukashvili, the commander of the Segev Shalom station, and Je'al Davidov, the commander of the Rahat police station. He was also killed in that area. So we're talking about several senior officers and several officers from special forces units. In total, 15 IDF and police officers were killed during the fighting there. But eventually, all of these terrorists were killed, and really the only sort of time when the massacres were carried out and the abductions were carried out was really at the start, when the local security team managed to defend against most of the attack, but not all of it completely.
We have very quickly touched on these probes. We also discussed them previously on a daily briefing episode, and I'll leave a link to that in our program notes too. There's so much more to say. We will say it as the time goes on. And Manny, I thank you so much for joining me today for this Friday focusing on the IDF probes into these terrible disasters.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.